afternoon, Sanibonani, goeiemiddag, Dumelang. My name is Kinta Burger. I'm the Registrar of UJ and I'm standing in for the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Chalitsi Marwala, who sent his apology and also his congratulations, but unfortunately he can't be here this afternoon. So then, on behalf of the university, it is really my privilege and honor to welcome you to the Professorial Inauguration of Professor Farai Nyabadza. A warm welcome to all of you, the family, friends and colleagues of Farai, to this joyful and landmark moment in achievement. In particular, I would like to welcome Professor Bettine van Vuren, who is the incoming registrar. She will take office 1st of April 2023. And then also in particular Professor Deborah Meyer, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Science. And then also Prof. Ibrahim Moumaniat, our respondent this evening. Prof, welcome to you and thank you for standing in as a respondent here this evening, and we are looking also forward to your address. Also, a warm welcome to all members of Senate and other colleagues and guests who are joining us via our online platforms. So, ladies and gentlemen, the inauguration of professors is a public ceremony in which a newly appointed professor is inducted into office and deliver their inaugural address. The ceremony of the inauguration of professors has its roots in the medieval university and serves multiple purposes. Firstly, it is an expression of welcome and an entry for new professors joining the circle of colleagues who are already professors. Secondly, it provides a platform for the professors to display their expertise in the discipline and showcase their research. And thirdly, it stands out as a moment of pride and celebration for the incumbent, the family, fellow scholars, the university, and society. In essence, it is a celebration on the achievement of major milestones, contributions to the discipline, and ultimately the impact on society. Today we gather to witness the entry of Professor Farai Nyabadza to the illustrious community of scholars at the University of Johannesburg. This evening we will listen to the inaugural address by Professor Farai Nyabadza as one further step in his journey of being a professor. This is a journey which does not culminate once the lecture has been given. The inaugural lecture is a self-reflective pause in the journey of the professor, with a promise of more to come to enrich our minds, and simultaneously contributing to the rich intellectual body of work in the discipline. Professor Nyabadza, we are looking forward to your address on mathematical modeling and its impact on policy, disease control, and management. Very relative. We are looking forward to that. And now I invite the Executive Dean, Professor Deborah Meyer, to introduce Professor Nyabadza to you. I thank you. Riali Boga, Nyabonga. Baie dankie.
Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Nyabadza. Farai Nyabadza graduated with a Master of Science degree in mathematics from the University of Zimbabwe in 1998 and a Doctor of Philosophy in mathematical modeling of infectious diseases in 2003 from the University of Botswana. He lectured at the University of Botswana from 2004 to 2007, after which he joined the South African Centre for Epidemiological Modeling and Analysis as a postdoctoral research fellow. While at this centre, he worked with the Desmond Tutu TB Centre in modelling TB in Masiphumelele in Cape Town. He then joined Stellenbosch University as a senior lecturer, where he rose to the ranks of associate professor. Prof. Nyabadza then joined the University of Johannesburg in July 2018 as a full professor, and he is also currently the head of Department of Mathematics and Applied Mathematics. Prof. Nyabadza was funded by Cancer South Africa on a project on predictive models for HIV-related cancers, and by the NRF on modeling substance abuse in the Western Cape province. He also received funding from various national and international funders for research in mathematical modeling of infectious diseases. He has successfully supervised 13 PhD students and 57 master's degree students. He has also written 3 academic books and has a significant number of collaborations globally. Prof. Nyabadza is the former president of the Southern African Mathematical Science Association, a regional body that strives to develop mathematical sciences in the Southern African region. He is an associate editor of 2 academic journals and has reviewed a number of articles for national and international journals. Prof. Nyabadza is passionate about motivational speaking and has written a book entitled Ordering Your Life for Success, Lessons from the Number Line. We look forward to hearing your inaugural address. Welcome, Prof. Nyabadza.
Good evening, colleagues, family, friends, and all those that gathered here to listen to this particular inaugural lecture. I will do the acknowledgements a little bit later in the talk, but I'm going straight to what we all came here for, which is basically my presentation on aspects of mathematical modeling and how it impacts policy, disease control, and management. So let's start. So my journey on this particular talk rests on these few aspects that I've put here. The first ones are basically my journey in PICS, and certainly I'll begin with some introduction, and then I'll give you what I will call Modeling 101, so that you understand the things that I'm going to be giving to you and talking to you about, which means certainly by the time we finish this lecture, each and every one of you will be a modeler to some extent. So we'll then do a little bit of, I'll give some examples of models that track policies, and then one of the main part of the talk is basically our recent work on the mathematical modeling of HIV and AIDS treatment policies in Botswana, with which I will present a little bit of some simulations and some concluding remarks. So I will start by giving you my very first journey. Apparently, this is the only picture I have of my childhood, given my background and all this other stuff. So you can actually see that this was actually my first month at the university, and I decided to take this particular picture. And then I enrolled into maths and geology, and I then decided to put the map of Zimbabwe and its geological features, and then this is when I was doing the studying part. Then the next article says, you know what, I met somebody then at that particular point, and this was my graduation with my first degree in 1994. And then later on, I then went to the University of Botswana, and here we have the former president of the Republic of Botswana, Honorable Festus Mogae, and his words at this particular graduation, being the first PhD student in mathematics at the University of Botswana, he actually said, "I see you going far, congratulations." So when he was saying that, there are these 2 people that did put the robe on me, which is their way of, when he graduated with a PhD, they rob you, and the man on the left is the very gentleman that introduced me to mathematical modeling. And the lesson I will give you today is the lesson that he gave to me. And because I understood it, my expectation is we will all understand it. So let's begin. So as an introduction, I will look at the aspect of a model. A model is simply a representation of reality. I'm afraid I have to stay close to the mic. Usually when the spirit of teaching pops up, then I might find myself walking around. But in this case, let me just stick around here. So a model is a representation of reality. And I have had so many students that then say, but we have often found human beings that are called models. Then I said, yes, they are simply a representation of reality. Because when you bring a lion when they are walking on stage, they will be like real human beings. So in the next, then we need to ask ourselves, what then is a mathematical model? So a mathematical model is a representation, certainly, of reality using mathematical expressions. And obviously, we all know that reality is complex. And in its complexity, we have then to build our models on assumptions. So it means that models are built on assumptions. The better the assumptions, the better the model. If the assumptions are bad, then the model will be bad. So mathematical models present a unique opportunity of investigating the management of diseases and influencing policy, and they're actually useful in our healthcare settings. So if you want to understand what a policy is, it is simply a course or a principle of action adopted or proposed by an organization, even including a country or even individuals. If you say individuals, I'm sure some that have homes will say the policy in this house is you don't arrive after 7. So it's a policy. So our countries have different policies with respect to the spread of infections. And some of them include aspects of vaccination, issues related to personal hygiene, some prevention of contagions, like the social distancing that we had, prevention of contagion, and sometimes information campaigns where media spread information with regards to a certain infection. So the other part would be treatment itself. So when we look at the questions that we want to attempt to answer in this particular session is, we want to answer questions, how can we best incorporate policies and mathematical models? And how will this influence the management and control of diseases? So let me begin with the lecture 101 that I was talking about. So this is basically what I was taught, that you consider an area A, you consider some area A. It can be, say, Gauteng, let's put it that way. Or you can put it as Rudeport, Florida, whichever area you stay. But don't go beyond that. Just look at some particular areas. Then when you look at that, then when there's an infection that is spreading, you can actually divide people according to their infection status. An example is COVID. You had people that never had the infection. You had people that had the infection. You had people that recovered from the infection. So you can divide your area, but by division, because this is a model, we can do whatever I'm doing. Because you can't say this area is for those that have, this one is for those that doesn't have. So we can actually just divide our area into this. So we can also then say some are infected, as I was explaining, some can be recovered. And you can then link these particular processes using these particular arrows. So if you are not infected, there's a probability that you can get infected when you interact with an infected individual. And this process here, we call it the transmission process. And this one here is the recovery process. In some instances, if a disease does not confer immunity, you can go back and become susceptible again. So the cycle then continues. So in essence, we can then go down and drill it a little bit and include mathematical symbols. Then you can call your susceptibles S, so that you don't forget that S is for susceptibles. You can go to infected, then you can say I is for the infected, R is for the recovered. And of course, S of T simply means the susceptibles at time T. That's all. So in essence, you can even go further and say if a model only has these 3 classes, then it is called an SIR model. Then whenever it has a recovered people that lose immunity coming back to be susceptible, we call it SIRS, because the people are now coming back to S from R. So you can then introduce a little bit of some calculus and say the rate of change of susceptibles with respect to time is given by the derivative ds by dt. And similarly, when you look at the change in the infected and the change in the recovered being given by those particular derivatives. Now, I will then say sometimes you can even have, when you include latency or exposure, because when you get infected, you don't become suddenly infectious or suddenly you say, I have a bug. Otherwise, the world will be fighting because you will say, you are sitting next to me right now and I already have an infection. It doesn't happen that way. So sometimes you catch the bug and you allow time for incubation. After that particular time, then you can then, during that time where the disease is incubating in you, we call it the time of exposure or incubation time, those individuals are referred to as the exposed. And such a model would then be called an SEIR model for the susceptibles, exposed, the infected, and those that recovered. So you can even have SEIRS if a person loses immunity. So obviously, all those four that I have, you can actually decouple those compartments. And when you decouple them, you now begin to have individual compartments in which you can actually attribute movement between classes as the infection status of an individual changes. Or if it doesn't change, they remain in that compartment. If it changes, they move accordingly. Now, I then decided for those of you that want to have a little bit of the flavor of the maths in there, we obviously have here that a susceptible individual interacts with a proportion of the infectives, which is I over N. Sometimes we can have some mass action thing where we just have an S and an I. This beta here represents the probability of infection multiplied by the number of contacts. We call it the effective contact rate. That is the contact that results in an infection, because it's not every contact that will result in an infection. So in the end, this is progression. You don't need to interact with anybody. That's why we have just have a parameter there representing the rate of progression, and this one is the rate of recovery. So you'll see a lot of these in some of these models. So let's begin with the first example that I wanted to put forward. The first example that I want to look at is the modeling of a policy of home-based care that was actually introduced in Zimbabwe at some point. And the first author here, unfortunately, he passed on the 16th of February this year. May his soul rest in peace. But we were actually quite interested in can we actually input this or model this change in policy. Now, what did this policy entail? So there was a change in care for people living with HIV and AIDS. So the care changed from hospital care to home-based care, which means that you couldn't get people to be cared for in the hospital. They had to be cared for in communities with community health workers helping in the process. So a mathematical model describing the dynamics of HIV and AIDS transmission with hospitalization and home-based care was constructed in our work, and the model was then fitted. When I say fitted, we are simply saying you are actually comparing the model that you have produced and the data that is existing. So, and that process is called model validation. So the model is then fitted to the prevalence data that comes from UNAIDS researchers. And obviously, we now looked at the implications of key epidemiological parameters that were in the model, and then we then made some long-term projections for this particular infection. Now, so the model then existed something like this. So you would certainly understand what the S means by now and what the I means by now. And obviously, these ones here are individuals that are infected but do not know their status. These ones here, they know their status. That's why I call them IS, because they have either been tested or they've been screened one way or the other. So this A represents individuals that would have developed AIDS, and this H is for those that are hospitalized, and this class here is for those that are in community home-based care. And obviously, I put the wrong picture here. There's also an arrow that goes to hospital when individuals are in communities. If it gets worse, they often go brought back to hospitals. Then, of course, with these deltas here, they represent mortality due to the disease, and these mu's that are here, they represent mortality that is natural. It doesn't mean that when you have an infection, you won't die naturally. You can die by a car accident, or you can die by any other means. So we also incorporate the natural mortality. These are all progression rates. The progression rates, the gamma 1, sigmas, rho 1, and all the thetas there, as individuals change their status in terms of the infection being modeled. So this is the first example. Now, the second example looks at the COVID-19 models. Now, most of the modeling for COVID-19 was actually borrowed from the modeling that was done on the MERS epidemic, the Middle East respiratory syndrome that actually occurred some time ago. And most of these models were actually of the SEIR type. And in essence, the overriding assumptions have been that our data is provided every day, and many of you would know that here in South Africa, you would wait, okay, not many of you, but for me, I would wait for the statistics of that particular day and record it on an Excel spreadsheet. But I know it was I could get it from somewhere, but I wanted to track what was happening each and every day. Now, there is also information that we need for our modeling process because it determines the parameter values, which is the period of incubation, that when you get the infection between 3 and 7 days, you become infectious. And obviously, the model also assumes that when a person recovers from a particular strain, you recover with immunity. And this is very common with all viral infections that have got the characteristics of the coronavirus. But however, when the strain changes or there's some kind of mutation, it doesn't matter whether you had COVID previously, you can still get infected, albeit your system can actually respond to that infection. So this is our very first model that we threw when it came to modeling COVID-19 in South Africa. In the early stages of the epidemic, we know that it was actually driven by immigration. There were actually people that came from elsewhere into a totally susceptible population. So those that came in, we're actually saying some that came in were actually susceptible, the others were actually exposed, assuming that those that were infectious and that showed symptoms could not travel. That's the assumption we made. But those that came exposed, by exposure, it just depends on how long the exposure was. You can actually arrive today and the following day you are infectious. And in many cases, this is what happened with our first case. And we all have this particular thing representing what was happening inland, and this was immigration. So we looked at this particular model. Of course, at the initial stages, these compartments here have initial conditions of zeros because there isn't anybody in there. But of course, these ones here, the initial condition is determined by the first people that came in exposed that we know. But of course, we know the numbers could be higher. So in a way, we then say to ourselves, we can actually then play around with these particular model. We can incorporate aspects of hospitalization, deaths in hospitals. We can even introduce a lot of parameters in the same model, but try to adjust it. One of the adjustments we even made was to separate this group of those that are infectious, because some were asymptomatic, which means they didn't show the symptoms. Others were symptomatic, which means they showed the symptoms. And that created a slightly different model and all the other things. So the interventions that we had were only what we refer to as the non-PIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions of social distancing, masks, and all the other stuff. So we know that obviously the lockdown allowed the government to prepare. And one of the things was that I liked the talk during those days. We want to flatten the curve. and one of the things that happened was, in the early phases, actually, if you look at it, this is the 24th of March, 2020. And around the 27th, we saw a change in the trajectory of the epidemic. And many of us were happy. And at some point, I thought this was just going to go down. But basically, we were then saying with our MERS models, if the epidemic had not gone this way, what would have happened? And we realized actually that this could have just been the trajectory. And of course, here we calculated this at 95% confidence interval statistically, and obviously this is how that particular epidemic progressed. But we saw that later on, we realized that, it actually took quite a long time for the epidemic, and this was actually part of the first wave. And this is what our model, the one in blue, and what the data is in those magenta colors. Now, so let's look at model number 3, which I want to, which is the second thing that we focused on. This is something that we looked at with respect to Ebola. And Ebola being a viral disease, we know that it appears quite a lot in many African countries. And we recently have, we had an outbreak in Uganda recently of Ebola, and of course many countries started being concerned because this is actually a very deadly disease. And obviously we know that many of the intervention policies, they center on the prevention of infection, and obviously also increasing access to treatment facilities, and also improved treatment outcomes for those individuals that are in treatment, because the case fatality rate for COVID-19 is around, so not for COVID, for Ebola is around 50%. When I mean case fatality rate, it simply means those that are infected, 50% of them are likely to die. And that is quite scary. So you need to improve the outcomes for those that are under treatment under those particular circumstances. So what we did was we then decided to formulate some model. Many of you, I'm sure you're already acquainted with the compartments, that this is a susceptible individuals here. Here are the exposed. Here we have got our infectives that are sort of like asymptomatic, and those that are symptomatic, and then the recovered, and then those that, unfortunately, this is the only modeling that is a bit skewed, where you classify individuals that die. Now, why are the dead so important in Ebola outbreaks? Because they are a cause of infection, especially cultural ways of burying people where you have to wash somebody's body and whatever. The fact that fluids are central to contraction of Ebola, this class is actually very, very important. And here we actually also have, these are treatment centers that are actually put as outposts to actually help people that are actually symptomatic. Now, this is actually an intervention that is usually recommended by the WHO, that you put out, other treatment outposts somewhere, not necessarily the hospitals that you have. You generate some tents or somewhere close to where the people are, and obviously this was the model structure of what we incorporated. Now, because we were looking at optimal control, we then decided for some of the mathematicians that are here, there is actually a class that is missing here. Please don't ask me why it is missing. The only important part is a few of these things. Now, one of the important parts is what I'm having here. Now, we have these things that I'm calling U1 here, and I'm calling U2 here, and I'm calling U3 there. These are what we refer to as the control parameters that are actually time-dependent. So you put them here, and some of you might actually see that if you increase U lies between 0 and 1. If you increase U, this part here starts decreasing. And in essence, what it means is that the infection process, because there's a minus there, we actually decrease the loss of the susceptible. So it's a control. Similarly, we can also add a control of getting people into our our treatment centers, and we can also add our control U3 here that also reduces the amount of people that are moving out of this and actually, or that increases the people moving out of O and that are becoming recovered. So I just thought I could put this slide for the fun of it. Not that I expect anybody to understand it, but I'm simply saying whenever we do our optimal controls, we sort of set like what we refer to as, in finance, they call it the cost function. And obviously here we call it the objective function. And obviously here we want to minimize the objective function subject to the controls that belong to a specific set of controls in this case. And obviously this thing here is an integral from 0 to some terminal time t. Of course, we want to minimize the individuals that are symptomatic and also our quadratic controls there. So there is a bit of some maths that is done there, but that's probably this is the last maths that you see. Right, okay. So, so let's just look at the work that we have been doing recently in Botswana, and I'm actually happy that the article came out today. So we were trying to look at the HIV and AIDS treatment policies of Botswana. Now, that policy is actually well-defined. That's the reason why we actually looked at it. So we actually said this policy can be divided into 3 epochs. We would call them 3 periods. Now, the first epoch runs from 1990 to 2001. And obviously, this was before the introduction of ARV treatment. Then the second epoch captures what happened between 2002 and 2015. Of course, in this particular period, the CD4 count was actually a criterion for one to enter treatment. Initially, you could only enter treatment if you had a CD4 count of 200. Then they raised it to 250. Then they raised it to 350. Then they raised it to 500. But the bottom line is the CD4 count was actually a criterion for you to access ARV treatment. Then after that, then there is a third epoch in which they said, as long as you test positive, you go onto treatment, which was the treat all kind of strategy. So because of the fact that these policies can easily be, modeled, we can actually model each epoch separately, which means that you can compare the 3 models, and what differentiates them is that obviously in the first model we didn't have treatment. So the second model now includes treatment, but then it also needs to include people who are waiting for that particular treatment. Then obviously we realized that in this case 2 compartments were added, and in 2016 the treat all strategy was launched, and the model changed by simply dropping the waiting part. You didn't need to wait. So in the process, we note that the second model was actually the biggest model. It had more compartments because then we had to divide the number of people that are actually in treatment. So we know that the first and the third epochs can be obtained from the second epoch. So we actually deliberately made sure that obviously when you make some parameters 0, you can get the model for the first period. If you make some other parameters 0, you get the model for the third period. So it was actually important that we just work on what we called the grand model, which is one single model. But then when you want to get information on the other models, you could simply set some of those parameters to 0 in this case. So our grand model appears like this. So in this case, we have people that are susceptible to the infection, the people that are infected. But here, these are the screened but are awaiting treatment. These are already that are on treatment, which means the screening happened and their CD4 count was allowing them to actually access treatment then this is actually the movement when you're waiting so that you access treatment. But if you wait and you fail to access treatment, you progress to the AIDS class. And these will also progress to the AIDS class, or you can simply progress to the AIDS class if you are not at all actually screened at this end. So in a way, this was our grand model. So we then decided to say, for every model on this grand model, mathematically from the theory of dynamical systems, you check whether the solutions exist or whether the solutions behave well, and this is what we do, where we check whether the solutions are bounded. And if anybody can remember what happened here in Gauteng, where we had a model which actually didn't obey these, and it predicted that we will have 1 million deaths due to COVID, and we prepared a gravesite. So, so it is actually important for this, whenever you create a model, to verify whether the solutions are well behaved, they don't go out of whatever it is. Solutions must be contained somehow. This is that mathematical thing. So I decided to just say one thing, that the model here has got what we refer to as the disease-free state, which means it will only have the first class of susceptibles, the rest will be zeros. And we use this to evaluate what is called the model reproduction number. Now, the model reproduction number is basically, by definition, we call it, whenever you introduce an infected in a wholly susceptible population, the number of new infectives that are generated by that person is what we call the what? Somebody's reproductive rate. So in essence, it is basically the number of new cases that are generated by an infected individual when they are introduced to a susceptible population. That is of interest because it determines how fast an epidemic is progressing. And in essence here, we note that our reproductive number is a sum of these 4 sub-reproduction numbers. And this one is for those we then actually separated them and say, we want to find the individual contributions for each class. So this is the contribution of those that are in I, this is the contribution for those that are in IW, this is the contribution for those that are in IS, and this is the contribution for those that are in the AIDS class. So we can actually evaluate the contribution of each infected class as we continue. All right, so let's look at some of our simulations and some of our data. So our data, of course, is extracted from the UNAIDS website. Usually, if my student was from Botswana, and when I said, please go and look for data from NACA. NACA is their National AIDS Council, and she said, they told me that I should go to the UNAIDS website. So we got the data from there, and we then used some built-in functions in MATLAB. Of course, the OD45, it's for those that are in numerical analysis. It's a hybrid of the Runge-Kutta method of order 4 and 5. And obviously, we also used what is called the F-min search algorithm that is used in trying to fit our models. By fitting the model, it means you are basically reducing the difference between your model and the data that you are actually modeling. So we begin by fitting our models over the modeling time that we have. So this is basically what we obtain. So this is for adults aged between 15 years and above who are living with HIV and AIDS. And of course, over the years from 1990 to 2019, we have all these data points that are actually the data that is released yearly. So what we did was we fitted the model for Epoch 1. But of course, in the article, we fitted the same data to Epoch 2, the same data to Epoch 3. But then we were only trying to say that if you fit one model, you are likely to have huge variations between the data and the model itself. So you can see that obviously our model is way, way below there, and it's above here, and here. It sounds okayish, but it is not very good. Why? Because we are fitting one model, the very first model that didn't have treatment, but here there are regions where treatment was in place. And if you looked at the other model, there was a time when there wasn't any treatment, but if you fit the model, depending on the model you fit, you can't just have one model for all these data sets because there were different policies for each individual times. So as a result of that, what we then did was we then decided to play around. I will just explain just one line, and then you will probably get what I'm basically saying. Now, what I'm calling this parameter here is called, this is a Greek letter by the name eta. So eta 2 here models the differences in infectivity between those that are in I weighting and I. So in essence, what we then said was, eta 2 is actually 0 for time between 0 and 12 years. That means from 1990 to 2002. But then thereafter, it became active from T greater than 12 up to T up to 27. That is 2016. But thereafter, it's actually 0. So in this case, we are simply trying to tell a code to actually, shut this particular parameter in some time zone, open it up in some time zone, and shut it down in the other time zone. So in this case, this then allows us to use our grand model to model or to fit our data between the 3 different epochs, because you can close one epoch and open it up, and so on and so on. And once that happens, then it means, obviously, for our function, what I've written here, this is, for the mathematicians that are here, this is a vector of derivatives. for each one of these particular models. So we have a model for before treatment, and we have a model in the second epoch, and we have a model between 2016 and 2019. And when you do the fitting, this is what you obtain. So you can actually see that this particular model fits quite closely to the data. And here, this thing has, for statisticians that are here, this has got a very good R-squared value, which measures the goodness of fit of our model here. So in this case, we then realize that the division or the introduction or the modeling of this epidemic using the different policies gives us a better model fit than simply designing one model and fitting it to data. So the division or the subdivisions of these epochs, because of the policy changes, gives us a better model in the fitting. And we went on to actually extend this and say, what then will be the projections up to 2030? And this is what we saw. It remains to be validated, so we'll wait until data from 2024, 2025 as it comes. And hopefully we'll continue to do the research. Then thereafter, we also try to say, what will happen if we increase testing and behavior change? We realize that we can actually change this particular trajectory here. In fact, the trajectory changes, it decreases according to that particular arrow. So in this case, you're actually able to evaluate and say, if you increase this policy by 50%, you will have this particular change. So in this case, you are able to quantify your policies as you go down. And what is it that we also looked at? What we also looked at was, what are the number of HIV/AIDS deaths that we can avert by simply introducing some policy? And if you look at the very first diagram here, obviously, in the first phase, we didn't have treatment. So there is no need for us to actually look at what are the deaths averted by introducing treatment. But one of the things that we look at is that we can actually, the one in red, there is no treatment, and the one that is in blue, there is treatment. And the area here, I'm sure some of you are already remembering in your calculus where you were asked to find the area between two curves. And this is where we use it. So in this case, you're actually saying the area here represents the number of AIDS cases that are actually averted. And we also do the same here, where we can also see that whenever you increase, this was just one increase of a parameter theta. Of course, theta did not appear before the treatment. But here we then included theta and M. M was simply a behavioral change parameter that we introduced here. So we can evaluate deaths as a result of non-change of behavior. And we see that obviously we have got a bigger number of cases avoided if we increase behavior change, and we also increase the rate of treatment there. So let me just put a little bit of some concluding remarks here. So obviously for the model that I've just presented, we know that a piecewise system here of 3 models here was analyzed to model or to track the policy changes in Botswana. And we note that obviously introducing policy changes in mathematical models is critical for a holistic view of the epidemic, because whenever you introduce policies, you expect some particular outcome. And obviously the structure then of the models became dynamic. They started also changing depending on the change in the policy. So introducing policies also changes the type of the models. And obviously that capturing of the policies improves our fitting in the case of the work that we have looked here. So we can actually also look at further refinements into these particular models that can be done, like including additional compartments that can capture some of the challenges of managing HIV in Botswana. In particular, there are aspects of dropouts, people that drop out of treatment programs. So policies around that can result in a change in the model structure of these kind of models. And there is one thing that we also saw, which we saw in Botswana. Which is one of the research projects that I was doing in my last visit to Botswana. They realized that despite, Botswana ticks all the UN AIDS boxes when it comes to their policies on on HIV and AIDS management. Like, there's this 90-90-90 policy, which means that 90% of the people that are infected must be tested. Of those, 90% must receive treatment. Of those, 90% must be virally suppressed. But Botswana actually is 95-95-95. But the HIV prevalence has not been going down, or the new infections has not been going down. And you know what they noticed? They now actually said one of the policies that they had made, somebody recommended that one of the policies they had made was actually causing their prevalence not to decline. And that policy was the exclusion of migrants from these free treatment processes. Because human beings are human beings. There's nowhere where you can walk around saying with a migrant labeled somewhere. So in essence, their policy now is as long as you are in the country, it doesn't matter whether you're whatever, if you can access HIV treatment, please go and access it, because it is actually very important. So they excluded 7% of the population, but by excluding it, even though you treat the 93%, you are actually not solving the problem. So they changed their policies, and this is what we were trying to incorporate into our model for HIV. So we have also looked at that whenever you are implementing control strategies, this is in the case of Ebola, some joint treatment of, implementation of these strategies is key, and it should be done in a coordinated fashion. And obviously, resources are an important part of what is important in managing infections. So there is some more research that we actually did with respect to inclusion of policies. And one of the research that we did was the impact of mass administration of ivermectin on a disease that is called onchocerciasis. And this was basically for some place in the Republic of Ghana, where they introduced mass treatment. So every January, the chief or the headman, they go with their people, you queue and you get vaccinated. And it is mandatory. And I don't know what they will do with those that have an option not to, or who say they don't want to be treated. But there, you probably will be exercised. You are chased away from the village. So you have to go and you get vaccinated. So we looked at one of those. So the other one that we looked at was actually one of this was done with one of our students here who graduated sometime last year. So he was looking at the potential impact of supplementary feeding. And this is actually in the poor rural places of Malawi, where they were introducing that, people that are on HIV treatment must actually receive supplementary feeding. And this had important treatment outcomes in the sense that when the nutrition was right, then certainly the treatment outcomes were also right. So the last one that we looked at was the ones that we looked at with my colleagues that are here, where we looked at aspects of stigma. And there are some of those things that I don't know whether somebody experienced that during COVID, when you cough, you will have many people that look at you. So there are all those particular things that we can include in our models and say, okay, can we model this? So what is it that we look at as future directions? We know that research is an evolving aspect, so collaborative networks also evolve. In fact, I do have one of my collaborators here, Professor Simon Mukwembi from WITS. We are working on some very interesting aspects of drug discovery using graph theoretic techniques, and it's actually a very interesting aspect. So this is what I mentioned earlier on about Botswana. So sometimes we may need to revisit the work that we have done before, and we have to re-look at the current trends. So probably, God willing, before I retire in 20 whatever, I will look at this model again and see whether the data is actually following the same trajectory. So visiting my research work. So let me have a few acknowledgements. So I want to acknowledge my family here. And it's the other one you saw her on the picture. She's seated here, and And my son, our firstborn, seated on the other side, and the secondborn, who is just behind there, Roslyn, who is in our Faculty of Health Sciences, doing biokinetics here, and we have Ariel, who is at Roosevelt, and the two little girls here that love their dad. Thank you so much. Then I also have my church family that is here. I know my pastor has just come here, and the other colleagues that I fellowship with. Thank you so much. I really acknowledge your presence, and also colleagues from the Department of Maths and Applied Maths that are here that are here and that are online, because I have heard many saying I'm logging in, which is okay. Then also the Faculty of Science, Prof. Mayor and your team, thank you so much. And also, of course, the UJ management. I'm told that I will probably be, I don't know if there's another one coming, but probably I'm the first one who has had 2 registrars standing by my side. So thank you so much for listening.
Good evening, Registrar, incoming Registrar, the Executive Dean of the Faculty, colleagues from the department, and also Professor Nyabadza's family. I've known Prof. Nyabadza for a long time, even before he was at UJ, and always talks about his family. And I'm glad he made the comment about his daughters. I think I've had 2 boys, one is married now, and only my daughter tells me she loves me. The boys just, I don't know, boys are something else, you know, I don't know. And it gives me great pleasure to be the respondent this evening to the work that Prof. Nyabadza has presented to us. We know the impact that HIV has had on our communities. We know the impact that COVID has had. Some of the things Prof. did not mention was his work on TB, for example, that has also had a massive impact. And even though COVID has taken our attention, TB is still there, and TB causes a lot of damage. The other disease that, if you're in Africa, you know about is malaria. Malaria is a big killer. My brother works in Nigeria, and every other week he has malaria, especially when it's the season. And yeah, that's it. It's one of those things you live with. Something Prof. Nyabadza also mentioned was the fact that when the first models were produced for COVID, there was this rush to believe the numbers. Right? There was a gut response, especially from society at large. People were grasping for truth. Yeah. And mathematics is the search for truth. And when mathematicians gave results to communities, their first answer was to dig graves, right? Our first answer is to ask more questions. So there was a bit of disjointedness in terms of the response. But even that changed. 2 years later, but it did change. And this is not unusual. I wanted to mention that someone like Galileo, whose results we use and take for granted, was actually kicked out of the church. I don't think that's going to happen with you if your pastor's here. But so I think you're on safe ground. I think you're okay. But there is a tendency to kind of blame the messenger. And if you work in this area, you tend to be the messenger of bad news, because there's never good news when you're looking at disease modeling. And I suspect that for people watching, communities, government officials, etc., the minute you add the box with the D, they don't want to know, because those are people who vote, people who pay taxes, people who go to church, right? So everyone wants to avoid that box. But unfortunately, COVID has shown us you can't. You can't run away from that box. Ebola as well, you can't run away. Famous South African comedian makes a joke about Ebola because he's now in the US. And he says that there were 2 US patients were the first people to have Ebola when there was the big breakout. They were flown to the CDC in the US. Never heard from again. They were fine. They got some magic medicine and they were fine. It's Africa where, very bad things happened. What Prof. Nyabadza has also shown, and this is the one field of mathematics that impacts beyond just a journal article, it does have an impact on policy. If you've worked for government, you know policy changes can take weeks, years, months. The policies never change fast enough for what's happening in society. It's always a change that's looking back and saying, well, this might happen again. So we need to make this policy change. What I suspect society has now learned is that there's a need to respond rapidly to various things. Water, for example, electricity, right? I had a colleague message me to say, I haven't showered for a few days. And then she corrected that to say that I haven't showered for a few days standing in the shower. I was like, no, I understood the first time, all right? I wasn't going to say anything. So in conclusion, what I will say is that I hope that those of you at home, those of you in the audience, have a better or greater appreciation for what mathematics can do. It can inform us, it can educate us, it can save lives if it's used correctly. Unfortunately, there was a president of a country I won't mention who used maths to try and win elections, right? And it happens. We can't run away from that. But as long as we have people like Prof. Nyabadza, always questioning, always searching, right? How can I do this better? How can I do this? And today with computers faster. Where can I get better data so that my models work better? So Prof. Nyabadza is around at the right time because data is available, computers are available, and it's an exciting time to be working in disease modeling. So Prof, thank you very much for a very, very exciting lecture. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we give another round of applause? Thank you very, very much. I must say, Prof, I found it absolutely fascinating. My background long time ago was also in mathematics, so from that perspective, but also in my current job as registrar, I was responsible for the policy, our mandatory vaccination policy, for access to the campus. And so, it was a difficult time. And then also the implementation and the exemption process, etc. And I must say, I'm very sorry that I didn't know about the work you are doing before that, because we also had to do a risk assessment, of the current situation, etc. So we hope, of course, that there will be not new challenges, but, you never know. You already hear some noise. So in future, definitely, I'm going to look, to our own colleagues to come and also advise and assist with these risk analysis, etc. So absolutely fantastic and fascinating. And you reminded us so very vividly about the importance of interdisciplinary work, something that here at UJ we really strive to do, about the collaboration, between disciplines and between countries here as well. And just the relevance of this mathematics that you are doing, And Prof, thank you so much for that fantastic response as well. You put it in the wider context. You really bring perspective of where this work can still further go, and the many applications there is. So thank you, Prof, and congratulations on behalf of UJ, and thank you to you, Prof, as well. So now we have the real honor and pleasure to do the robing, similar to what you experienced there, that you show in your picture journey. We're going to add to your pictures this evening, so if the colleagues can come and assist me here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you can assist with the hat, and Prof. Deborah, you with the... And we will do it similar to what you showed us in your pictures. We're going to do it for on these sides, yes. Yeah. Of could come with that. And on the left. Yeah. Thank you. So what remains is to say thank you to you here in the room. It's good to have people again in the room, and to really applaud the professor while you are sitting here. But then also to our online viewers this evening. So thank you for joining. And now what remains is for those that are here in the room to go next door for refreshments. Unfortunately, those that are virtually, grab something at home. Thank you very much. Please join us next door.